Before we begin tonight, I want you to take a moment. Look at where you are right now. Notice what time it is. Leave me a comment below telling me your location and the time there. And if you're settling in to hear this story with me, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps others discover these cases that deserve to be told. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about a family of 3 who drove into the Oklahoma mountains to look at land and never came home. Their truck was found days later with their dog still inside, $32,000 in cash in the back seat, and all their belongings untouched. For years later, their skeletal remains were discovered just miles from where the truck was abandoned. But no cause of death could be determined, and the mystery of what happened to them remains unsolved. This is the story of the Jamison family, Eufaula, Oklahoma. It's a small town in the southeastern part of the state, population around 3,000, situated on the shores of Lake Eufaula. In 2009, it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where life moved slowly, where nothing much ever happened. Bobby Dale Jamison was 44 years old in October 2009. He'd suffered a serious back injury in a car accident in 2003 that left him with chronic pain and on disability. Those who knew him described Bobby as intelligent but troubled, someone who'd struggled with his relationship with his father and seemed to be searching for something, though what that something was remained unclear. Sherilyn Leanne Jamison was 40 years old. She was also on disability, claiming to suffer from bipolar disorder. Sherilyn had a son from a previous relationship who lived with his father, but her focus in 2009 was on Bobby and their daughter. Their daughter was 6-year-old Madison Stormy Starr Jamison, a little girl with her whole life ahead of her, caught up in whatever darkness would ultimately consume her family. The Jamisons lived in a lakeside home in Eufaula. They had timeshares in the United States and Mexico. On paper, they appeared to be living well, though they were actually living beyond their means, relying on disability payments and whatever other income sources they had. But there were signs that all was not well with the Jamison family. Bobby and Sherilyn were intensely religious, but in ways that seemed to veer into paranoia. They claimed their house was haunted. Bobby told their pastor he'd seen 2 to 4 ghosts on the roof. Sherilyn had purchased a satanic Bible, which she claimed was a joke, but Bobby admitted to his pastor that he'd read it. They'd pulled Madison out of kindergarten, claiming problems with the Eufaula School District. They were planning to sue the school, though over what remained unclear. Bobby was involved in legal disputes with his father, Bob Dean Jamison. He'd filed a protective order against his father, claiming Bob Dean had threatened to kill him and his family. Bobby alleged his father had hit him with his vehicle, that his father was involved in drugs and criminal activity, that he was a very dangerous man who thinks he is above the law. Sherilyn had claimed someone poisoned her cats in the weeks before October 2009. She'd spray-painted messages on a storage container they owned, writing, "Witches do not like it when their cats are killed." By October 2009, the Jamisons were planning to leave Eufaula. They wanted to buy 40 acres of land near Red Oak, about 30 miles away in the Sans Bois Mountains, and live in a storage container on the property. Why they wanted to live in a storage container in the remote mountains was never fully explained. On October 8, 2009, the Jamison family loaded up their pickup truck and drove toward the Sans Bois Mountains to look at the land they were considering purchasing. They never came home. On October 16, 2009, 8 days after the Jamisons were last seen, hunters on dirt bikes came across an abandoned pickup truck on a mountain road in Latimer County. The truck was parked on a remote dirt road, about a quarter mile from where the Jamisons had been looking at property. The hunters initially thought the truck had only been there a few hours, but when they looked more carefully, they realized it had been abandoned for days. They contacted police. When officers arrived and examined the truck, what they found was deeply puzzling. Inside the truck was the Jamison family's dog, Maisie. She was severely malnourished but alive, having survived 8 days without food or water, waiting for her family to return. Bobby's cell phone was on the ground near the driver's side door. A GPS unit was nearby. Sherilyn's purse was on the passenger seat, containing her driver's license and identification. In the back seat, Investigators found a brown bag containing $32,000 in cash. $32,000. Both Bobby and Sherilyn were on disability. They had no apparent source of income that would explain having that much cash. Where had it come from? What were they planning to do with it? All of the family's belongings were in the truck. Wallets, IDs, their daughter's toys. Nothing had been taken. If this was a robbery, why would the thieves leave $32,000 behind? But there was no sign of Bobby, Sherilyn, or Madison. And more troubling, there was no sign of struggle. No blood, no indication of what had happened to them. A massive search was launched. Over 300 volunteers and law enforcement personnel combed the area. Search dogs, helicopters, ground teams hiking through the dense woodland of the Sans Bois Mountains. They followed GPS coordinates found in the truck, looking for any trace of the missing family. They found nothing. No bodies, no clothing. No signs that the Jamisons had walked away from the truck and into the wilderness. The case quickly went cold. Theories proliferated, but evidence was scarce. Had the family been abducted? Murdered? Had they walked into the wilderness and gotten lost? The Sans Bois Mountains are remote, heavily wooded, dangerous terrain. But why would they leave their truck with all their belongings, including their dog and $32,000? For 4 years, the disappearance of the Jamison family remained a complete mystery. November 16, 2013. 4 years after the Jamisons disappeared, 2 hunters were scouting for deer hunting locations in a remote area of the Sans Bois Mountains when they noticed something unusual. Bones, scattered among the leaves and undergrowth. They looked closer and realized with horror that these were human remains. The partial skeletal remains of 3 people, 2 adults and 1 child. The hunters immediately contacted authorities. Search teams arrived and carefully processed the scene. They found shoes, bits of clothing, adult teeth, arm and leg bones, bone fragments. The remains were scattered, partially concealed by years of falling leaves. The location where the remains were found was less than 3 miles from where the Jamison family's truck had been abandoned in October 2009. The remains were sent to the Oklahoma office of the chief medical examiner for analysis. Due to the advanced state of decomposition after 4 years, identification wasn't immediate. Anthropological and forensic pathological testing was required. On July 3, 2014, the medical examiner's office officially confirmed what everyone suspected. The remains were those of Bobby Jamison, Sherilyn Jamison, and Madison Jamison. The Jamison family had been dead since shortly after they disappeared in October 2009. They'd been lying in the woods less than 3 miles from their truck for 4 years while searches came up empty, while theories swirled, while their family waited for answers. But the medical examiner could not determine a cause of death. The bodies were too decomposed. There were no obvious signs of trauma to the bones. No bullet holes, no fractures, nothing that definitively showed how they died. One of the skulls had a small hole that was initially suspected to be from a gunshot, but later analysis couldn't confirm this. The hole could have been from decomposition or animal activity rather than a bullet. Without a cause of death, without witnesses, without any clear evidence of what had happened to them, the Jamison family case remained as mysterious as ever. When police reopened their investigation after finding the remains, they reviewed evidence from 2009 that had seemed odd, but hadn't led anywhere at the time. The most unsettling piece of evidence was security camera footage from outside the Jamison home, recorded the day they disappeared. The footage showed Bobby and Sherilyn loading their truck, preparing for the trip to look at property. But their behavior was bizarre. They walked back and forth between the house and truck dozens of times, moving items in a slow, trance-like manner. They didn't speak to each other. They didn't interact normally. They moved mechanically, silently, as if in some kind of fugue state. Investigators who watched the footage described it as deeply unsettling. The couple looked like they were sleepwalking, or under the influence of drugs, or experiencing some kind of psychological break. Had they been drugged? Were they suffering from carbon monoxide poisoning that affected their behavior? Were they in some kind of dissociative state? The footage raised more questions than it answered. Also puzzling was what wasn't found. Sherilyn was seen in the security footage placing a brown briefcase into the truck. That briefcase was never located. Neither was a handgun that Sherilyn owned. Both had vanished along with the family. Had the briefcase contained something important? Had someone taken it from the truck after the family disappeared? And what about the gun? Had Sherilyn taken it with her when she left the truck? So where was it? The $32,000 found in the truck also remained unexplained. Sherilyn's mother suggested it might have been payment for the land purchase, though that seemed like an unusual amount to carry in cash to look at property. Others speculated about drug involvement, that the money was either payment for drugs or proceeds from selling them. But if the Jamisons were involved in a drug deal, why would they bring their 6-year-old daughter? And if it was a drug deal gone wrong, why hadn't the money been taken? In the absence of definitive answers, multiple theories emerged about what happened to the Jamison family. The murder theory suggested the family had been killed by someone, either randomly or deliberately. Bobby's father, Bob Dean Jamison, was an obvious suspect given the protective order and Bobby's claims about threats. But Bob Dean had died in December 2009, 2 months after the family disappeared, and had been in poor health at the time. His brother claimed Bob Dean was either in hospital or a rest home when the Jamisons vanished and wasn't capable of being involved. But could Bob Dean have hired someone to kill his son's family? The theory had some plausibility, though no evidence supported it. Another suspect was Kenneth Bellows, a handyman who'd stayed with the Jamisons briefly. After discovering he had white supremacist beliefs, Sherilyn had kicked him out at gunpoint. Bellows was reportedly part of a group called the United Knights, and Sherilyn's name was allegedly on a hit list, but police investigated Bellows and cleared him. An empty pill bottle with his name on it found in the truck was explained as left from a previous occasion. The drug deal gone wrong theory focused on the $32,000 and the couple's strange behavior in the security footage. Perhaps they'd been meeting someone in the mountains to buy or sell drugs. Perhaps something went wrong. Perhaps all three were killed, and the killer left the money behind, spooked by having murdered a family, including a child. But this theory struggled to explain why the Jamisons would bring Madison to a drug deal, and why their bodies were found so close to the truck rather than having been hidden more thoroughly. The cult theory came from Sherilyn's mother, who believed her daughter's family had been murdered by a religious cult operating in southeastern Oklahoma. The theory pointed to the Jamisons' religious paranoia, their talk of witches and ghosts, their strange behavior. But no specific cult was ever identified, and no evidence supported cult involvement. Some theorized that the family had been placed in witness protection because of Bobby's father's alleged involvement in drugs and crime. This would explain their disappearance without violence. But the discovery of their bodies in 2013 definitively ruled out this theory. The exposure theory suggested the family had simply gotten lost in the mountains. Perhaps they'd walked away from the truck to explore the property, gotten disoriented, and died from exposure. Oklahoma in October can have cold nights. If they'd wandered into the wilderness without proper clothing or preparation, hypothermia could have killed them. But this theory struggled to explain why they'd left the truck with all their belongings, including coats that would have kept them warm. The frustrating reality of the Jamison family case is that nearly every question about it remains unanswered. Why did Bobby and Sherilyn exhibit such strange behavior on the security footage? Were they drugged? Suffering from mental illness? Under some kind of psychological distress? Where did the $32,000 come from? What were they planning to do with it? What happened to Sherilyn's briefcase and handgun? Were these items taken by whoever killed the family? Or did Sherilyn have them when she left the truck? Why were the bodies found so close to the truck? If the family had been murdered, why weren't they hidden more thoroughly? If they died from exposure, why had they left the truck at all? How did they die? The medical examiner couldn't determine cause of death. Were they shot? Poisoned? Did they die from exposure? Without soft tissue to examine, without bullets or other evidence, the pathologist couldn't say. Who saw them last? A man who lived in the mountains reported seeing the Jamison family on October 8, 2009, but said he saw no one else in the area. Was he telling the truth? Or did he see something he didn't report? The case has been investigated extensively. The Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, the Latimer County Sheriff's Department, the FBI, all have examined the evidence, followed leads, interviewed witnesses, but no arrests have been made. No suspects have been definitively identified. One investigator noted that the case has an overwhelming amount of evidence, but all of it is circumstantial or contradictory. Every piece of evidence seems to point in multiple directions simultaneously. The remote location where the bodies were found was searched multiple times in 2009 without finding anything. An assistant special agent from the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation explained that falling leaves had potentially obscured the bodies during earlier searches. But 3 miles is not a great distance. Why didn't search dogs find them? Why didn't aerial searches spot them? The answer appears to be that the mountainous, heavily wooded terrain, combined with the bodies being scattered and partially buried by leaves, simply hid them too effectively. Today, 15 years after the Jamison family disappeared, their case remains officially unsolved. No one has been charged with their deaths. No definitive explanation for what happened to them has emerged. The Jamisons were a troubled family. Bobby's chronic pain, his conflicts with his father, his religious paranoia, Sherilyn's mental health issues, her talk of witches and poisoned cats, the family's isolation, pulling Madison from school, planning to live in a storage container in the mountains. These factors suggest a family in crisis, people who were struggling, who perhaps weren't thinking clearly, who made decisions that put them in danger. But troubled families don't usually vanish without a trace. And the evidence at the scene, the $32,000 left behind, the security footage showing their strange behavior, all suggest something more than a family simply getting lost in the woods. The most likely explanation, given all the evidence, is that the Jamisons were murdered. By whom and for what reason remains unknown. Perhaps it was related to the cash they were carrying. Perhaps it was connected to Bobby's father or the conflicts within that family. Perhaps it was a random encounter with someone dangerous in the remote mountains. But without witnesses, without a clear cause of death, without anyone coming forward with information, the truth may never be known. For the extended Jamison family, particularly Madison's half-brother and the families of Bobby and Sherilyn, the lack of answers has been agonizing. They buried their loved ones, but they still don't know what happened to them. The case serves as a reminder of how remote the American wilderness can be. The Sans Bois Mountains aren't far from civilization by distance, but they're isolated enough that 3 people could disappear completely, be murdered or die from exposure, and lie undiscovered for 4 years. Bobby Jamison was 44 years old when he died. Sherilyn was 40. Madison was 6. A family of 3 who drove into the mountains one October morning and never came home. Their truck was found with everything inside except them. Their bodies were found 4 years later, just miles from where the truck sat. But how they died, who killed them if someone did, what they were doing in those mountains with $32,000 in cash, all remain mysteries. The Jamison family case is one of frustration. So much evidence, yet none of it conclusive. So many theories, yet none proven. So many questions, yet no definitive answers. Perhaps someday someone will come forward with information. Perhaps a deathbed confession will emerge. Perhaps new forensic techniques will allow the remains to be re-examined and a cause of death determined. But for now, the Jamison family mystery remains exactly that, a mystery. 3 people who vanished into the Oklahoma mountains and were found dead years later. Their fate unknown, their story incomplete. If you have any information about the Jamison family case, the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation continues to accept tips. Even 15 years later, information could matter. If this story has moved you, please remember to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Share the Jamison family's story. Remember Bobby, Sherilyn, and especially 6-year-old Madison, who deserved better than she got. Thank you for listening tonight. Before we dive into tonight's story, if you're enjoying this content and want to see more deep investigations like this one, please hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and share it with someone who loves true crime. Your support helps bring attention to cases that deserve to be told. Now let's begin. Phoenix, Arizona, May 17, 2001. The desert sun blazed over Paradise Valley High School as students poured out of classrooms, celebrating the last day of junior year. Summer stretched ahead like an endless promise. For 17-year-old Alyssa Turney, it should have been a day of freedom, of graduation parties and new beginnings. Instead, it became the day she vanished without a trace. This is the story of a girl who disappeared in broad daylight, a stepfather with dark secrets, a sister who refused to give up, and a case that would take nearly 20 years to reach a courtroom, only to end in a way no one expected. Alyssa Marie Turney was born on April 3, 1984, to Barbara Farner and Stephen Strom. When Alyssa was just 3 years old, her parents divorced. Her mother, Barbara, eventually married Michael Turney, a former electrician and sheriff's deputy. Michael brought 3 children from his previous relationship into the marriage, and Barbara brought Alyssa and her older brother. Michael adopted both children. Soon after, Michael and Barbara had a daughter together, Sarah. For a brief time, the blended family of 6 children seemed complete. But tragedy struck when Alyssa was only 9 years old. Barbara died of kidney cancer, leaving Michael to raise all the children alone. By the time Alyssa turned 17, the older children had moved out. Only Alyssa and 12-year-old Sarah remained in the house on Bell Road and 34th Street, living under Michael Turney's increasingly watchful eye. Alyssa was, by all accounts, a typical teenager. She worked part-time at Jack in the Box. She had a boyfriend named Jonathan Lockman. She dreamed of freedom, of California, of getting away from the strict rules that governed her life at home. Her friends described her as spirited, rebellious in the way many teenagers are when they're testing the boundaries of independence. But those who knew her well also knew something else. They knew Alyssa was trapped. They knew she lived in fear. And they knew that her stepfather, Michael Turney, was not the protective parent he claimed to be. Michael Turney controlled every aspect of Alyssa's life. He installed surveillance cameras throughout the house, both inside and outside. Every phone in the home was equipped with recording devices that captured every conversation. He would drive to Alyssa's workplace at Jack in the Box and film her from his car, sometimes arriving an hour or 2 early to ensure she didn't leave with anyone. He made her sign bizarre contracts, parent-child agreements that attempted to dictate her every movement, every choice, every breath. When Alyssa's friends later spoke to investigators, they painted a picture far darker than mere strictness. They told stories of sexual abuse, of Alyssa confiding in them about incidents that made her terrified to be alone with her stepfather. One friend said Alyssa had described waking up bound and gagged, with Michael on top of her. Another said Alyssa told him that Michael had driven her out to the desert and assaulted her. And remarkably, a year before Alyssa disappeared, Michael had contacted Child Protective Services himself. He told them that if Alyssa ever came forward with allegations of abuse, she would be lying. It was a preemptive strike, an attempt to discredit his stepdaughter before she could speak. By the spring of 2001, Alyssa was counting down the days until she turned 18. She had talked about moving to California, where an aunt was willing to take her in. She had even written a driver's education essay calculating the time and distance it would take to drive there. In recorded phone calls, later released by investigators, Alyssa could be heard asking her boyfriend if his parents would let him go to California with her. She had told her older brother James that she wanted to come live with him. James, who was 10 years older than Alyssa, had seen the way Michael treated the girls after their mother died. He had wanted to take both Alyssa and Sarah in, sensing that something was terribly wrong. But he never got the chance. Because on May 17, 2001, Alyssa Turney disappeared. It was the last day of school. Sarah, then 12 years old, was on a field trip to a water park with her 7th grade class. Alyssa had plans to attend a graduation party that evening. According to Michael Turney, he picked Alyssa up from Paradise Valley High School around 11 in the morning. He said they went out to lunch together, just the 2 of them. During that lunch, Michael claims they got into an argument. Alyssa wanted more freedom. She wanted to stay out later with her friends. Michael told her that wasn't going to happen. Not under his roof. Not while she was under his control. He said the argument escalated. He said Alyssa became angry. After lunch, Michael claims he dropped Alyssa off at home around 1 in the afternoon. He then left to run errands and to pick up Sarah from her field trip. When Michael and Sarah returned home later that evening, Alyssa was gone. Her cell phone was still there. Her car was parked outside. Her makeup, her hairbrush, her house keys, all of it remained untouched. In her bank account sat $1,800, money she had been saving from her job. She never withdrew a single cent. But in her bedroom, Michael said he found a note. A handwritten note in Alyssa's own handwriting. The note said she was running away to California. She couldn't live there anymore. She was leaving and she wasn't coming back. Michael Turney reported Alyssa missing that night, calling the Phoenix Police Department to tell them his 17-year-old stepdaughter had run away. At the time, police saw no reason to suspect foul play. Alyssa was 17, just a few months shy of 18. She had no history of mental or physical health issues. There was a note in her own handwriting. Her friends and family confirmed she had been unhappy at home, that she had talked about wanting to leave. The police classified Alyssa as a runaway. They entered her information into the National Crime Information Center database, and then, for the most part, they moved on. Phoenix police handled thousands of runaway reports every year. Alyssa Turney was just another teenager who wanted to escape a strict household. Except she wasn't, because Alyssa never called anyone. She never contacted her friends. She never touched her money. She never showed up anywhere. She simply vanished, as if she had never existed at all. A week after Alyssa disappeared, Michael Turney told police he received a phone call. It was early in the morning, and the call came from a payphone in Riverside, California. Michael claimed the voice on the other end was Alyssa's. He said she was angry, that she cursed at him, told him to leave her alone, and then hung up. Police checked the location of the payphone. They found no evidence that Alyssa had been there. No witnesses, no security footage, nothing. The call, if it even happened, led nowhere. For the Turney family, life tried to move forward. Sarah, who had just finished 7th grade, believed her father's story. She thought Alyssa had run away. She thought her sister had chosen to leave them behind. It wasn't until years later, when Sarah was in her 20s, that she began to question everything she had been told. It wasn't until years later that she realized her father had been lying all along. The case went cold. For 5 years, nothing happened. Alyssa's name sat in a database, one missing teenager among thousands. Her case file gathered dust. Her friends and family moved on with their lives, though they never forgot her. And then, in 2006, something strange happened. A man named Thomas Albert Heimer, serving a life sentence in a Florida prison for murder, wrote a letter to a prison guard. In that letter, Heimer confessed to killing Alyssa Turney. He claimed he was a serial killer, that he had murdered multiple victims, and that Alyssa was one of them. When Phoenix police received the confession, they began to investigate. They interviewed Heimer, trying to determine if his story was legitimate. But as they dug deeper, inconsistencies emerged. Heimer's description of Alyssa didn't match reality. The details he provided were wrong. When pressed, Heimer admitted he might have been mistaken. He might have confused Alyssa with a different victim. The confession was a hoax, nothing more than the fantasy of a man seeking notoriety from behind bars. But Heimer's false confession had an unintended consequence. It forced Phoenix police to take a closer look at Alyssa's case. And when they did, they realized something they should have seen from the very beginning. Alyssa Turney had not run away. Alyssa Turney had been murdered. In 2008, the Phoenix Police Department Missing Persons Unit officially reopened Alyssa's case. Detectives Stuart Summers-Ho and William Anderson were assigned to lead the investigation. They began by interviewing everyone who had known Alyssa, her friends, her boyfriend, her teachers, her co-workers at Jack in the Box. And as they spoke to these people, a disturbing pattern emerged. Nearly everyone pointed to the same person, Michael Turney. Alyssa's friends told detectives about the abuse. They told them about the surveillance, the control, the fear that Alyssa had lived with every single day. Her boyfriend, Jonathan Lockman, confirmed that Alyssa had confided in him about her stepfather's behavior. He said she was terrified of Michael, that she had told him things that made him deeply uncomfortable. When detectives examined the evidence more closely, they found inconsistencies in Michael's story. The note Alyssa supposedly left behind, while written in her handwriting, seemed off. Runaway teenagers don't typically leave notes. They leave in secret, not wanting to be found. And if they do leave notes, they don't usually leave behind all their money, their belongings, their phone. Everything about Alyssa's disappearance suggested she hadn't left voluntarily. Everything suggested something terrible had happened to her in that house on the last day she was seen alive. In December 2008, 7 years after Alyssa disappeared, Phoenix police executed a search warrant at Michael Turney's home. What they found inside was beyond anything they could have imagined. The house was filled with evidence of Michael's obsession. There were dozens of videotapes, some dating back to the 1980s, showing surveillance footage from around the property. Michael had been recording his family for decades, but notably, there was no footage from May 17, 2001, the day Alyssa disappeared. The tapes from that day were missing, but the videos weren't the most shocking discovery. In the garage and throughout the property, police found an arsenal that suggested Michael Turney was preparing for war. 19 high-caliber assault rifles, 2 homemade silencers, a van filled with gasoline cans, and 26 pipe bombs, improvised explosive devices filled with gunpowder and roofing nails, designed to cause maximum carnage. Police also discovered a manifesto, 98 pages long. The document was titled Diary of a Madman Martyr. In it, Michael laid out a conspiracy theory. He believed that the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, a union he had once been affiliated with during his time as an electrician, was responsible for Alyssa's disappearance. He wrote that the union had hired assassins to kidnap and murder Alyssa, and that they had buried her body in Desert Center, California. He claimed he had already killed 2 of these so-called assassins in self-defense. And he detailed a plan to attack the union's headquarters in Phoenix on December 15, 2008, during a scheduled meeting. He planned to set off explosives, kill as many people as possible, and then take his own life. Michael Turney was arrested on December 11, 2008, just 4 days before his planned attack. He was charged with possession of unregistered explosives and weapons. In March 2010, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to the maximum term of 10 years in federal prison. While Michael Turney sat behind bars, Sarah Turney was growing up. She had spent most of her life believing her father's story, believing that Alyssa had simply run away. But as she got older, doubts began to creep in. Michael's story kept changing. First, he said he had dropped Alyssa off at home after lunch. Then he said they had argued. Then he said he had received a phone call from her. The details never quite lined up. And the more Sarah learned about her sister's case, the more she realized that something was very, very wrong. In 2017, Michael Turney was released from federal prison. He had served his sentence for the weapons charges, but no charges had been filed in connection with Alyssa's disappearance. Legally, he was a free man. Sarah, now in her late 20s, couldn't accept that. She couldn't accept that her father was walking free while Alyssa's case remained unsolved. So Sarah decided to do something about it. In June 2019, Sarah Turney launched a podcast called Voices for Justice. In the podcast, she told Alyssa's story in meticulous detail, drawing on over 3,000 pages of publicly released police documents. She interviewed friends, family members, and anyone who had known Alyssa. She laid out the evidence against her father piece by piece, building a case in the court of public opinion that prosecutors had failed to build in a court of law. The podcast gained a following, but it wasn't enough. Sarah needed a bigger platform. She needed to reach more people. She needed to force the authorities to act. And then, in April 2020, during the early days of the global pandemic, Sarah discovered TikTok. At first, she joined the app as a distraction, something to pass the time while the world was locked down. But she quickly realized that TikTok could be something more, could be Alyssa's opportunity. Sarah began posting videos about her sister's case. She posted clips from Michael's surveillance videos, showing him filming Alyssa at work. She posted recordings of phone calls. She posted interviews and case documents. She used popular sounds and trends on the platform to make the content engaging, to make people stop scrolling and pay attention. And it worked. Within weeks, Sarah's videos had been viewed millions of times. She gained hundreds of thousands of followers. People who had never heard of Alyssa Turney before were now demanding justice for her. The hashtag Justice for Alyssa began trending. Comments poured in, urging Phoenix police to reopen the investigation, to arrest Michael Turney, to do something, anything, to bring Alyssa home. The pressure worked. On August 19, 2020, nearly 2 decades after Alyssa disappeared, a Maricopa County grand jury indicted Michael Roy Turney on a charge of second-degree murder. Police arrested the 72-year-old man in Mesa, Arizona. When Sarah heard the news, she broke down. She posted a video on social media, tears streaming down her face. "We did it," she said. "After almost 20 years, we did it. Never give up hope that you can get justice." Michael Turney made his first court appearance the following day. A judge denied his request for a reduction in bond. He would remain in jail until his trial. For Sarah, it felt like vindication. It felt like all the years of fighting, of advocating, of refusing to let Alyssa's case be forgotten, had finally paid off. But the battle was far from over, because proving Michael Turney's guilt in a court of law would be far more difficult than gaining public attention on social media. Michael Turney's trial began in July 2023, nearly 3 years after his arrest. The case drew significant media attention. Dateline, 2020, and countless other true crime programs covered the story. The courtroom in Maricopa County was packed with journalists, true crime enthusiasts, and members of the Turney family. Sarah Turney took the stand early in the trial. Her testimony was emotional and powerful. She described the years of surveillance, the control, the fear that had permeated their household. She told the jury about asking her father what had happened to Alyssa, and she recounted his chilling response. He told her he would tell her on his deathbed. Not now. Not when she needed to know. Only when he was ready to die. The prosecution built their case around circumstantial evidence. They presented testimony from Alyssa's friends, who spoke about the abuse they believed she had suffered. They called Detectives Stuart Summersho and William Anderson to the stand, who walked the jury through the investigation and the inconsistencies in Michael's story. They pointed out that Alyssa had left behind everything she owned. Her money, her phone, her car, her entire life. They argued that no teenager planning to run away would do that. They argued that Michael Turney was the last person to see Alyssa alive, and that his behavior both before and after her disappearance suggested he was guilty of her murder. But the defense had a powerful counterargument. There was no body. There was no crime scene. There was no physical evidence linking Michael Turney to Alyssa's death. In fact, there was no evidence that Alyssa was even dead. Yes, she had disappeared. Yes, the circumstances were suspicious. But without a body, without forensic evidence, without a confession, how could the state prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Michael Turney had committed murder? After the state rested its case on July 17, 2023, Michael Turney's defense attorneys, Jamie Jackson and Olivia Hicks, filed a motion for acquittal under Rule 20 of the Arizona Rules of Criminal Procedure. The rule states that a court must enter a judgment of acquittal if there is no substantial evidence to support a conviction. The defense argued that the prosecution had failed to meet that standard. They argued that the state had presented no physical evidence that Alyssa was dead, and no evidence that Michael Turney had caused her death. They argued that circumstantial evidence, no matter how compelling, was not enough. The judge agreed. On July 18, 2023, Judge Halterman granted the defense's motion for acquittal. All charges against Michael Roy Turney were dismissed. He was released from custody immediately, having spent 3 years in jail awaiting trial. In the courtroom, Sarah Turney was devastated. She had fought for years to see this day, to see her father held accountable for what she believed he had done to her sister. And now, in an instant, it was over. Michael Turney walked out of the courtroom a free man. Outside, he spoke briefly to reporters. He maintained his innocence, as he had throughout the entire ordeal. He said he would never stop searching for his daughter. But to Sarah and many others who had followed the case, those words rang hollow. The legal system had failed Alyssa Turney. The state of Arizona cannot bring homicide charges against Michael Turney again. Before we begin tonight, I want you to take a moment. Look at where you are right now. Notice what time it is. Leave me a comment below telling me your location and the time there. And if you're settling in to hear this story with me, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps others discover these cases that deserve to be told. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about a 21-month-old boy who disappeared from outside a Greek farmhouse one summer afternoon in 1991. A case that would span 3 decades, hundreds of reported sightings, excavations for buried remains, and a mother who never stopped searching. A mystery that remains unsolved. This is the story of Ben Needham, Kos. It's a Greek island in the Aegean Sea, part of the Dodecanese group of islands near the Turkish coast. In 1991, Kos was already a popular tourist destination, known for its beaches, ancient ruins, and warm Mediterranean climate. But it also had quieter areas, rural villages where Greeks lived traditional lives away from the tourist resorts. Ben Needham was born on October 29, 1989, in Sheffield, England. He was the son of Carrie Needham, then 19 years old. Ben's early life was typical of a toddler, filled with the discoveries and developments that come with those first years. In 1991, Carrie's parents, Eddie and Christine Needham, made a decision that would change their family's life forever. They decided to move to Kos. They'd purchased a farmhouse in the village of Iraklis, near Kos town, that needed extensive renovation. The plan was to turn it into a home they could live in, perhaps eventually a property they could rent to tourists. The move offered opportunities, a new life in the Greek sunshine, escape from the cold and rain of northern England, a fresh start. Carrie and Ben went with them. Carrie found work at a local hotel, using her wages to help support the family while her parents worked on renovating the farmhouse. It wasn't easy work, the renovation. The property needed substantial repairs. But Eddie and Christine were determined, and they had help from local workers. By July 1991, the family had been on Kos for several months. Ben was approaching his 2nd birthday. He was a blonde, blue-eyed toddler, energetic and curious as 21-month-old children are. He was beginning to talk, to run, to explore the world around him with the fearlessness of a child who doesn't yet understand danger. The farmhouse in Iraklis was isolated, surrounded by fields and rural land. There were few neighbors nearby. Building materials were scattered around the property. Renovation work was ongoing. It wasn't an ideal environment for a small child, but the family was managing. Wednesday, July 24, 1991, was a hot summer day on Kos. Carrie had to work at the hotel. Eddie and Christine were at the farmhouse, continuing their renovation work. Ben was left in their care, as he often was when Carrie was working. It was supposed to be a normal day. Carrie would work her shift. Eddie and Christine would watch Ben while also working on the house. The toddler would play in the yard, supervised by his grandparents. But that afternoon, in a span of minutes that no one can fully account for, Ben Needham disappeared. The exact timeline of Ben's disappearance has never been completely clear. What is known is that on the afternoon of July 24, 1991, Ben was playing outside the farmhouse while his grandparents were nearby, having lunch and working on renovations. Around 2:30 p.m., Eddie and Christine realized Ben wasn't where they'd last seen him. The farmhouse yard was small, enclosed. A 21-month-old couldn't have gone far. They called for him. They searched the immediate area. Ben was gone. At first, there was confusion more than panic. Perhaps Ben had wandered into the house. Perhaps he was hiding, playing a game. Perhaps Carrie's brother, who was also on Kos, had taken Ben for a ride on his moped without telling anyone. But as minutes became an hour, as the searches became more frantic, as it became clear that Ben hadn't just wandered into another room or wasn't with his uncle, the terrible reality set in. Ben had vanished. The Greek police were called. Officers arrived at the farmhouse and began an immediate search of the surrounding area. The fields, the nearby roads, any place a toddler might have walked to, they found nothing. No sign of Ben. No footprints leading away from the property. No witnesses who'd seen him wandering. Nothing. Carrie was contacted at work and rushed back to the farmhouse. She arrived to find police searching, her parents distraught, and her son simply gone. The hours that followed were a blur of activity and growing dread. More police arrived. Search dogs were brought in. Neighbors were questioned. Had anyone seen anything? Had anyone noticed a vehicle in the area? Had anyone heard a child crying? One piece of information did emerge. Witnesses reported seeing a white Suzuki vehicle parked near the farmhouse around the time Ben disappeared. 3 people had been in the vehicle, a woman in the back seat and 2 men in the front. But the vehicle had left before anyone thought to note the license plate or get a better description of the occupants. Was this significant? Had Ben been taken by someone in that vehicle? By nightfall on July 24, 1991, Ben Needham had been missing for hours. The Greek police were treating it as a possible abduction. A 21-month-old doesn't vanish without a trace unless someone has taken him. In the days immediately following Ben's disappearance, the search intensified. Greek police, aided by British authorities, conducted extensive searches of Kos. The island isn't large, only about 40 kilometers long and 8 kilometers wide at its widest point. If Ben was still on Kos, surely he could be found. Search teams combed through fields, forests, and beaches. Divers searched the waters around the island. Helicopters surveyed from above. Every abandoned building, every cave, every location where a child might be hidden or might have wandered was checked. British and Greek media picked up the story. Ben's photo was circulated widely. His distinctive blonde hair and blue eyes made him easily recognizable. Appeals were made for anyone with information to come forward. 2 days after Ben disappeared, on July 26, 1991, witnesses at the local airport reported seeing a child matching Ben's description with a woman. The child appeared to be being taken off the island. But by the time police followed up, the woman and child were gone. If it had been Ben, the opportunity to recover him had been missed. This sighting, unconfirmed and never followed up successfully, would haunt the investigation for years. Had Ben been taken off Kos within 2 days of his disappearance? Was he on the Greek mainland? In Turkey, just a short distance across the Aegean? Somewhere else entirely? Carrie Needham was devastated. Her son had been taken, she was certain of it. And whoever had taken him had moved quickly to get him off the island before police could stop them. The theory that emerged in those early days was that Ben had been abducted for illegal adoption. In the 1990s, child trafficking for adoption existed, particularly in less developed parts of Europe. Greece had seen cases of children being sold to childless couples desperate for a baby. Ben's young age, his blonde hair and blue eyes, his Western European appearance, all made him potentially valuable in such a market. The theory was that someone had been watching the farmhouse, had seen an opportunity when Ben was unsupervised for a few minutes, and had grabbed him. If this theory was correct, Ben might be alive, raised by adoptive parents who may or may not know he'd been stolen. He could be anywhere in Europe or beyond, living under a different name, speaking a different language with no memory of his biological family. But proving this theory was impossible without evidence, without witnesses, without finding Ben himself. In the months and years following Ben's disappearance, over 300 reported sightings came in. Ben, or boys who looked like him, were spotted across Greece, on multiple islands and on the mainland. Some sightings came from Turkey, others from as far away as Germany and even Australia. Each sighting was investigated. Each one raised hopes in the Needham family that this might be Ben, that finally he'd be found. In December 1995, 4 years after Ben disappeared, a private investigator named Stratos Bakurtzis reported finding a blonde boy, about 6 years old, living with a Romani family in a camp near Salonika, Greece. The boy matched Ben's description. His age was right. He claimed he'd been given to the Romani family because his parents didn't want him. Police took the boy into custody and conducted DNA testing. The results were negative. The boy wasn't Ben. He had a birth certificate, a documented history. His father was in prison. The story was sad but legitimate. This pattern repeated throughout the 1990s and 2000s. A sighting would be reported. The family would hope. Investigators would follow up. DNA tests would be conducted. Each time, the result was the same: not Ben. In 1998, a holidaymaker saw a blonde boy playing on a beach in Rhodes. In 1999, a photograph taken in a Turkish village showed a blonde child who resembled age progression images of Ben. In 2003, Carrie traveled to Kos with Ben's uncle to follow up on new leads. Each false lead was emotionally devastating. The hope, the anticipation, the crushing disappointment when yet another DNA test came back negative. Some of the sightings were undoubtedly genuine mistakes. People who saw a blonde child and, having heard of Ben's case, reported it out of a sincere desire to help. Others may have been hoaxes, people seeking attention or money, but they all had to be investigated. The alternative, ignoring a lead that might actually be Ben, was unthinkable. As the years passed, the sightings became less frequent. Ben would have been growing up, changing. He wouldn't look like a toddler anymore. By the early 2000s, he'd be a teenager. By 2010, a young man. If he was still alive, if he'd been raised by someone else, would he even know he'd been taken? Would he have any memory of his first 21 months of life? The Needham family never gave up hope that Ben was alive somewhere. Carrie, now growing older, marked every birthday Ben missed, every Christmas without him. She kept his case in the public eye, giving interviews, maintaining a website dedicated to finding him. Then, in 2012, a new theory emerged that would change the entire direction of the investigation. In October 2012, 21 years after Ben disappeared, South Yorkshire police, who were assisting Greek authorities with the case, received information from a new witness. This witness claimed to know what had really happened to Ben Needham. According to the witness, Ben hadn't been abducted at all. He'd been killed in an accident. On July 24, 1991, building work had been underway at and near the farmhouse in Iraklis. A man named Konstantinos Barkas had been operating a digger, an excavator used for moving earth and rubble. The witness claimed that Barkas had told him that Ben had been accidentally struck and killed by the digger, and that Barkas had then buried the child's body in the rubble he was moving. This theory was shocking and horrifying, but it had a certain terrible logic. It would explain why Ben had vanished so completely. It would explain why no witnesses had seen an abduction. It would explain why the hundreds of sightings had never led anywhere. If Ben had been accidentally killed and his body buried in construction rubble, he might never be found. Building materials from the farmhouse renovation had been scattered, dumped in various locations. Ben's remains could be anywhere. Konstantinos Barkas had died in 2015, before this theory emerged publicly. He couldn't be questioned. He couldn't confirm or deny the allegation. But the witness's information was specific enough that police took it seriously. In October 2012, a joint operation between South Yorkshire Police and Greek authorities began. They would excavate the area around the farmhouse, searching for Ben's remains. The excavation was extensive. Forensic archaeologists, ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs trained to detect human remains. The search focused on areas where rubble from the construction work had been dumped. Carrie Needham, told to prepare for the worst, traveled to Kos to be present during the excavation. After 21 years of believing her son was alive, being raised by someone else, she now had to confront the possibility that he died the day he disappeared. The search lasted weeks. Every piece of rubble was examined. Every area the radar indicated was excavated. The work was painstaking, emotional, watched by media from around the world. One item of particular interest was found: a small yellow dinky toy car, a brand of toy vehicles popular in the early 1990s. Ben had been playing with a toy car the day he disappeared. Could this be it? But no human remains were found. No bones, no clothing, no definitive evidence that Ben had been buried there. In September 2016, police returned to Kos for further excavations. New information had emerged, additional areas that might contain Ben's remains. The yellow dinky car found in 2012 had been tested. There were traces of blood on it. Could the blood be Ben's? DNA testing was conducted, comparing the blood to samples from Ben taken at birth during the routine heel prick test performed on all British newborns. In November 2018, the results came back. The blood on the toy car was not Ben's. This was both disappointing and confusing. The car had been found in an area connected to the construction site. It was the right type of toy, but the blood wasn't Ben's. Detective Inspector John Cousins, leading the British investigation, made a statement that received significant media attention. Despite not finding remains, he believed Ben had died in an accident near the farmhouse. The recovery of the toy car, its location, and the circumstances all pointed toward this conclusion in his professional opinion. But professional opinion isn't the same as proof. Without remains, without definitive evidence, Ben's disappearance remained officially unsolved. Carrie Needham refused to accept that her son was dead. She continued to believe he was alive, raised by someone else, perhaps unaware of his true identity. She pointed to the lack of remains as evidence that Ben hadn't died in an accident. The investigation continued at a lower intensity. Periodically, new leads emerged. In 2021, witness reports claimed an English-speaking child around Ben's age had been found about 600 miles from Kos around the time of his disappearance, taken in and raised by the woman who found him. In 2024, a Danish man came forward claiming to be Ben Needham. He said his grandparents had told him he'd been taken from Kos. He described memories of being hidden, of hearing someone shout "Ben" at him at a market years ago. DNA testing was arranged. Carrie Needham, now 51 years old, prepared once again for results that might finally answer the question of what happened to her son. But as of now, those results have not been made public. The pattern has repeated so many times before. A potential lead, DNA testing, negative results. Today, more than 33 years after Ben Needham disappeared, his case remains unsolved. He has never been found, alive or dead. No one has ever been arrested in connection with his disappearance. The truth of what happened on July 24, 1991, remains unknown. Several theories persist. The accident theory, supported by some investigators, suggests Ben was killed by the digger and his remains were scattered or buried in construction rubble. The lack of found remains doesn't disprove this theory. It simply means the remains haven't been located. The abduction theory, which Carrie Needham maintains, suggests Ben was taken for illegal adoption. If this is true, Ben could be alive today, 35 years old, possibly unaware of his true identity or vaguely aware that something about his childhood doesn't add up. Some investigators believe witnesses on Kos know more than they've said. The witness who claimed Barkas admitted to the accident has refused to speak to police again. Others connected to the construction site have been less than forthcoming. Cultural differences, language barriers, and the passage of time have all made it difficult to get complete cooperation. Carrie Needham has pleaded with authorities to return to Kos, to re-interview witnesses who lied or refused to talk properly, to speak with police officers involved in the original investigation. She believes answers exist on that island, that someone knows what really happened to Ben. The case has drawn comparisons to other missing child cases, particularly that of Madeleine McCann, who disappeared from Portugal in 2007. Both cases involved British toddlers vanishing while on holiday in southern Europe. Both generated massive media attention. Both remain unsolved. But Ben's case predated Madeleine's by 16 years, and the response to it was different. Technology was less advanced in 1991. Media coverage was less intense. The investigative resources available were more limited. Some have suggested that if Ben had disappeared in 2007 rather than 1991, the outcome might have been different. More immediate response, better forensic capabilities, greater international coordination. But speculation about what might have been doesn't help find Ben or answer what happened to him. Ben Needham would be 35 years old today if he's still alive. He'd be a grown man, perhaps with a family of his own, with a career and a life. Or he died at 21 months old. His life ended by accident or violence. His remains lost somewhere on or near coast. Carrie Needham is now in her 50s. She spent more than 3 decades searching for her son, keeping his case alive, refusing to give up hope. She's endured hundreds of false leads, multiple excavations, countless disappointments. She's been told to prepare for the worst, told her son is dead, told to accept that he'll never be found. But she continues to believe Ben is out there somewhere. That someday, someone will come forward with credible information. That the right DNA match will finally be made. That after 33 years, she'll be reunited with her son. The investigation remains open. South Yorkshire police continue to review leads as they emerge. Greek authorities maintain their files on the case. Ben's photo, age progressed to show what he might look like today, is still circulated. If Ben Needham was abducted and raised by someone else, he would now be old enough to research his own origins. If he's ever felt that something doesn't add up about his childhood, if he's wondered about gaps in his early memories, if family stories have never quite made sense, that curiosity might lead him to search. DNA testing is simple now. If Ben is alive and submits his DNA to any genealogy database, it could match with family members. The technology that has solved other cold cases could solve his. If you have any information about Ben Needham's disappearance, you can contact South Yorkshire Police or Missing People UK. Even after 33 years, information could be crucial. Ben's family deserves answers. Carrie deserves to know what happened to her son. Ben deserves to be found, whether that means finding him alive or finally locating his remains so he can be properly laid to rest.